Over the past few years, there have been multiple cases of missing young black men from across America turning up deceased under extremely similar circumstances. Almost every single case is riddled with controversy, with most victims ending up in a nearby river or waterway, usually after suspiciously suffering from some kind of mental health crisis. But despite the numbers really starting to stack up, I can almost guarantee that this is an issue you have not heard any mainstream news outlets talking about, and yet, each year, countless missing person victims continue to be found in rivers, with the police never being able to find a suspect or even confirm a cause of death. So in this video, I will be exploring some of the standout cases that I've already covered on this channel, as well as a few others that you likely haven't heard of, as based on the evidence, I believe there's a chance that there could be an epidemic unfolding before our very eyes. Now, just before I get into the first story, let me quickly say for the record that all of these cases have occurred in the last few years, and every single one of them is still yet to be solved, as far as I could tell from my research. However, if there are any cases which have a confirmed conclusion that has not been documented in the news, please let me know and I will update this video accordingly. So, without further ado, let's get into the first case. On Thursday the 11th of April, just last month, a 37-year-old man named Robert Long was last seen outside his property located next to the Des Plaines River in Joliet, Illinois, before he would mysteriously disappear. After failing to respond to any of his family's calls, they eventually decided to officially report him as missing to the Joliet Police Department before commencing their search of his property. The police would then begin conducting interviews with potential suspects and witnesses from the time he disappeared. However, these efforts would unfortunately not conjure up any leads, leaving the officers scratching their heads as to what could have happened. However, on Friday the 19th of April, just 8 days after Robert's disappearance, the Joliet Fire Department would begin their own search along the Des Plaines River, with concerns that he could have somehow ended up in there. And to their dismay, at around 10:47 AM that very morning, not too long after starting their search, Robert's remains were discovered. According to the police, there were no obvious signs of foul play, but due to the nature of the case, it wasn't something they would rule out either. Surveillance footage would also later be found by the authorities, but they have not publicly released the footage, so it is currently unknown as to how Robert Long ended up in the river that day, and therefore, his case remains unsolved. But as tragic as it sounds, Robert is certainly not the only man to have gone missing in Illinois, only to end up being found deceased in a local river, as demonstrated by the heartbreaking case of Jovon Nelson. On Tuesday the 9th of April, again just last month, a 24-year-old man named Jovon Nelson was last seen running from his home in a panicked state before he would mysteriously disappear. According to witnesses, it seemed as if Jovon had escaped from somewhere and was being chased, as he was seen begging for help from locals, eventually running into a police officer on a bridge in Chicago. However, after asking for help, he was simply told to call 911, so after returning back to his girlfriend's house, he pulled out his phone and did just that. Jovon also called his mother and asked her to pick him up right away, explaining that there was somebody at the door and he felt unsafe. But after arriving at the house, she was disturbed to see that he was no longer home, and therefore, concerned that her son may have been in danger, she decided to officially report him as missing to the Chicago Police Department. However, after 3 weeks of investigating and several search attempts conducted by the family, Jovon's remains were unfortunately discovered in the Calumet River on Chicago's far south side. But once again, to this day we still don't have a true cause of death and no suspects have been named thus far. But to add even more fuel to the fire, there are several more cases that have occurred in the state of Illinois over the last few years that have also ended in a very similar fashion. But one particular example which stands above the rest in my opinion would have to be the controversial case of Jelani Day. On Tuesday the 24th of August in 2021, a 25-year-old graduate named Jelani Day was on his way to Illinois State University for an important meeting with his professor. However, after arriving on campus in the early hours of the morning, he would make the extremely out-of-character decision to skip his meeting and instead drive over to a cannabis dispensary, which would be his last official sighting. The young man was quickly reported missing by his mother after she received a call from the university about his absence, but strangely, the police refused to act, given that Jelani had only been missing for a few hours at the time, so the official report wasn't made until the next day. But unfortunately, this decision would soon reveal itself to be a grave mistake, as Jelani's car was eventually discovered around 60 miles away in the neighbouring city of Peru, and after searching the nearby river, his decomposing body was found. An investigation into Jelani's death was immediately conducted. However, despite the incredibly nefarious nature of this case, the police are still yet to apprehend a suspect, believing the most likely cause of death to be self-inflicted drowning. But moving away from the state of Illinois, we open ourselves up to a whole host of other equally suspicious cases which also remain inconclusive to this day, such as the mysterious case of Quadir Diaz and Ausar Scott Thomas. On Wednesday the 6th of March, just earlier this year, an 18-year-old soon-to-be father named Quadir Diaz would say goodbye to his mother Tanisha as he headed out for a midnight drive with his friends Ausar Thomas and Dante DeLuce. But at approximately 3 a.m. the next morning, Dante would unexpectedly show up at Tanisha's house alone, visibly shaking at what he had just experienced. According to Dante, the three boys had somehow gotten themselves involved in a high-speed chase across town in Quadir's Nissan Maxima, and that Ausar, who was driving at the time, had crashed the vehicle, causing the group to scatter in different directions. So in response to this concerning news, Tanisha decided to check with the local hospitals and police stations to see if her son had been registered anywhere. But upon speaking with the authorities, she soon found out that this story was a lie, and that her son had more than likely been kidnapped. However, after a month of searching, the Philadelphia police would eventually discover the remains of the two young men, with Ausar's body being located in the Schuylkill River, and Quadir's body later being uncovered in the nearby Wissahickon Creek. The case was then immediately upgraded to a homicide investigation, especially given the nature of how they disappeared. But strangely, after a month of investigating, there are still no confirmed suspects in their case, leaving their families understandably heartbroken and desperate for answers. And unfortunately, this would appear to be a key theme in these types of cases, as despite the obvious signs of foul play, months can eventually go by with no answers, inevitably leading these cases to fall into obscurity, which is a fate that I truly hope doesn't meet the family of another young man named Darius Appiah. On Wednesday the 24th of January earlier this year, a 22-year-old man named Darius Appiah was last seen picking up his dinner from a restaurant in Stafford, Virginia, before he would mysteriously disappear. At the time, he was supposed to be heading home after work along Mine Road, when an unassuming restaurant employee would briefly glance at the young man, not thinking too much of it at the time. However, little did they know, this would be the last official sighting of Darius, as his phone would suddenly shut off an hour later. As the night progressed, his pastor father became concerned that Darius still hadn't arrived home as planned, so as this behaviour was very unlike his son, he decided to officially report the 22-year-old man as missing to the local police. Search parties were then organised and images of Darius were quickly posted across the news and social media in the hopes that somebody would recognise his face, and eventually his car was traced back to a local park where it was locked and abandoned with the food still inside. However, after 1 week of searching in the surrounding area, the decomposing remains of Darius Appiah were eventually discovered in the Hazel Run Creek, located within the Alum Spring Park where the car was found just a few days earlier. But just as with the other cases in this video, no suspect was ever named, with the Stafford Police Department refusing to believe that any foul play was involved. So to this day, his death remains a mystery, despite the fact that his family have been working so hard to fight for justice. Which is a very similar situation that Shun D Riley's family have found themselves in, as they grieve the loss of their loved one who also disappeared without a trace, only to be found weeks later under extremely suspicious circumstances. On Thursday the 9th of May, just 2 weeks ago, a 35-year-old father named Shun Riley was supposed to be on a remote work trip in the city of Kelso, Washington, when he would mysteriously disappear. A few days after arriving, he would accidentally call his wife, Mary, in the early hours of the morning, to which she could only hear muffled sounds for about 3 minutes before eventually deciding to hang up the phone. However, concerned by the strange phone call, she immediately called him back in the hopes that he would pick up and explain the situation. But to her confusion, after answering the phone, Shun would continue to make muffled sounds before a voice could be heard clearly stating, "Go this way, go this way." Mary then hung up again after failing to get her husband's attention and called the hotel he was staying at to ask if they could conduct a wellness check at 3 a.m. But once again, she was left puzzled when the hotel staff confirmed that his hotel room was unlocked and Shun was nowhere to be seen. So, after her confusion quickly escalated to fear, Mary then called the local police to report the incident, and soon after accessing the security footage at the hotel, they discovered that Shun could be seen leaving the hotel alone, looking like he was in an extreme amount of distress. So in response to this troubling news, Mary and the rest of the family instinctively travelled all the way up from Long Beach, California, to look for Shun themselves and to help spread awareness of his case. However, after 1 week of searching, his body was eventually discovered in the Cowieman River near Manasco Drive, which was located just a short distance from the Comfort Inn hotel he was staying at. Now, this case is incredibly fresh, but the cause of death has still not been determined, and the investigation is currently ongoing to find out what really happened. But as far as the police are concerned, just like with the other cases, there has been no mention of foul play. So until more evidence is uncovered, we may never know what truly happened that night. Which heartbreakingly seems to be the case with another young man, who after suffering an apparent manic episode would go on to disappear into the night, never to be seen alive again. On Sunday the 10th of December just last year, a 19-year-old man named Daquan Rountree decided to run from his home in Portsmouth, Virginia, after suffering from an apparent psychotic break before he would seemingly vanish into thin air. The next day, Daquan was quickly reported missing by his father, as he was rightfully concerned for the safety of his child, given that the young man had left the house with no clothes or his cell phone. However, later that day, a tip came in from a woman living nearby who claimed to witness a naked man running down the street around an hour after he disappeared. So with this new information, the Portsmouth police, working alongside the local community, then conducted several searches in the hopes they would find the troubled teenager before it was too late. But despite the huge efforts of everybody involved, they sadly could not prevent the tragic event that had already taken place, as after searching around his place of work at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, they would discover his lifeless body in the surrounding water. The police then attempted to investigate this possible crime and would inevitably conclude that no foul play was involved, leaving his family distraught by the fact that they may never know what truly happened to their loved one. And this is unfortunately the exact same situation that occurred to yet another young black man who disappeared near his place of work. On Saturday the 25th of November just last year, a 25-year-old veteran and father of two named Jamell Lee Heung II was spending the night with some friends when he would suddenly disappear without a trace. He was last seen at the Indian Head Naval Base in Maryland, where he lived with his wife and two young children alongside many of his friends who were also based in the same area. It is still unknown what happened that night, but at around 2 a.m, Jamell decided to leave the bar, likely heading back to his family, but strangely, he would never make it home. A missing persons report was made shortly after, and the Charles County Sheriff's Department would eventually act after 48 hours, sending officers out to his last known whereabouts. However, after searching the surrounding area and sending divers into a nearby creek, they were soon mortified to discover Jamell's car submerged under the water. But to everyone's surprise, after continuing to search the creek, the divers were unable to find any trace of Jamell himself. But just a few days later, the officers were eventually notified about a body that was discovered around 2 miles away from Slavin's Dock, the very same location where Jamell was last seen. And after examining the body, it was revealed that it did in fact belong to the young father of two. But despite an investigation into the death of Jamell taking place right away, 6 months later we still have no idea what really happened to him, leaving his family desperate for answers and understandably heartbroken over the loss of their loved one. Now, believe it or not, I could continue to reel off many more examples of these types of cases from this year alone, such as Dal Mabil, whose court case is still currently pending after his body was discovered in the Pearl River of Mississippi, with the police once again claiming no foul play was involved. So if you would like me to document more of these cases in a future video, just let me know in the comments. But before I get too carried away with these stories, I want to get back to the matter at hand, which is to address why these tragic events keep taking place, and why despite the numbers continuing to increase year on year, that the police seem to do nothing about it. The fact is, we do have an epidemic on our hands, regardless of who or what is responsible for these young men's deaths, as it simply cannot be a coincidence that they always seem to end up in similar locations under similar circumstances. Also, whether it be down to mental illness or possible involvement in illicit crimes, the police always seem to have an elaborate excuse for why there is nobody at fault for the deaths, and eventually the media decide to move on, leaving the grieving families in a state of paralysis as they fight a losing battle for closure. Now, saying this, I'm sure it is possible that some of the cases I detailed could be down to nothing more than personal decisions. And I'm not saying that every single incident of a black man being found in a river is 100% murder, but the rate at which these unsolved cases keep cropping up in today's society, especially with the level of surveillance we have, is simply too coincidental to ignore, in my opinion. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here, but if there are any other cases that I didn't mention that you feel are worth exploring, please let me know their names in the comments, as I think it would be useful to continue documenting as many cases as we can, to hopefully draw more attention to this problem. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe for further updates on these stories. Also, if you would like to hear more details about any of the cases I covered in this video, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now.